Hello and welcome to another episode of War Thunder with your host Czar Peppers. A number of weeks ago they introduced the bulk of the British tank line, and since then I've been doing the grind to start unlocking as many as possible. I had this particularly fun match in the Cruiser Mark III tank, so I thought I'd show you guys the replay and give you a little information on the history and capabilities of this British cruiser tank. Before we go into this tank specifically, I should go over the British tank doctrine before and during the Second World War. They had two main classes of tank: the infantry tank, slow-moving tanks that move up the infantry at walking speed, aiding them by taking out machine gun nests, bunkers, and other impeding things with high explosive shells, and cruiser tanks like the Crusader that would exploit breaks in enemy lines to cause havoc in the rear, basically taking on the role of the cavalry. The A-15 Crusader belonged to the former of those two classes of tank. They were built on the Christie suspension system, where each road wheel was sprung independently, allowing for faster travel, particularly on rough terrain. It was invented by an American by the name of J. Walter Christie, who tried to market it to the American military initially, but they had little interest in the development. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, did show interest in the new suspension system, since their territory was massive and with few developed roads, making something like the Christie suspension system extremely desirable. The BT line of tanks would be some of the first to use the system, and later on the famous T-34 would also use the same suspension. When the representatives for the British armour industry saw the BT tanks in action, they urged the British government to create something similar based on the Christie design. This resulted in the cruiser tanks, A9 and A13 respectively, that would eventually evolve into the A-15 Crusader. The A-15 was developed alongside the A-13 more or less. During this period, the British were absolutely desperate for new tanks, since the vast majority of their tanks were lost during the evacuation of France. Because of this, they were basically approving tanks straight from blueprints, putting them straight into production without much of a testing phase. Because of this, there were a number of faults that made it into the production line, such as with the A-13 that had flawed engine ventilation, resulting in it being unable to operate in the desert theater. But the problems weren't noticed until it was already well into its production. They were able to correct the issues in the A-15 prototype though, putting into it the new British-made V12 engine, the Liberty Mark I, and it also possessed a longer hull and 5 road wheels versus the Cruiser's 4, allowing for better weight distribution. It went into production immediately after its limited prototype phase in the mid-1940s, too late for the French campaign though, but it would soon be shipped to North Africa to go up against the Italian forces there. They performed quite well against the Italian designs. The Mark I had armor up to 40mm thick. On paper it was able to resist fire from guns up to 37mm, and it did make limited use of angled armor on the turret and the glacis. But there were still flat surfaces that were vulnerable. As for firepower, they were mounted with the 2-pounder or 40mm anti-tank gun, a gun that was alright against the more primitive Italian designs, but it would soon prove lacking against the more modern German armor. The 6th Royal Tank Regiment was the first to use the Crusader Mark I, fighting alongside the slow Matilda infantry tanks. The Italian tanks wouldn't really pose much of a threat, but that would soon change with the arrival of Rommel the Desert Fox equipped with the Panzer IIIs with the 50mm anti-tank gun. The Mark II Crusader, the first Crusader that you can unlock in War Thunder, saw some improvements in armor to help deal with the 50mm anti-tank gun on the Panzer IIIs. Because of this extra weight, they fitted it with the Liberty Mark III engine, slight improvements on the Mark I, but even with these improvements, the Panzer III with the 50mm anti-tank gun and the Panzer IV with the 75mm proved to be more than a worthy adversaries for the Crusaders and other British tanks. That, combined with their tactic of retreating into areas covered by the German 88mm flak guns, proved to be extremely deadly for the British tank crews. With these new arrivals came the need for a more effective gun, and eventually the Crusader was chosen as a platform to mount the proven 6-pounder or 57mm anti-tank gun to. This required a complete redesign to the interior of the tank, along with more improvements to the armor. The one downside was there was no longer enough room for a dedicated loader, meaning that the commander would have to take over the role of loading the gun while still doing his job of commanding the crew. This new tank would be known as the Crusader Mark III, the second and last variant of the Crusader that is available in War Thunder. The 6-pounder proved to be quite effective against the Panzer III and the Panzer IV, and in the game I can say that it is a gun that I have found highly effective against a number of different targets, with as much as 100mm of penetration. They're quick. I think they handle quite nicely when you get used to it, with an extremely fast hull traverse rate, and that gun will one-shot whatever you're shooting at most of the time, granted your target isn't at an extreme angle in relation to you. So there it is, some neat information about the evolution of the Crusader A-15 tank. By the time 1943 came around, they were regarded as being obsolete, and tanks like the Cavalier, Centaur, and Cromwell would gradually begin to replace them in the field. There were still Mark IIIs seen in action in Tunisia in 1943, but by 1944 most were converted or only used for home defense purposes. But it certainly played an important role during the early stages against the Italian forces in North Africa, and even later on with the arrival of the Desert Fox, while the British were trying to come up with more efficient designs. So, that concludes our video for today. Please subscribe and like or dislike, and you can also check out my Twitter to stay informed about new videos if I remember to put the link in the description. So, until next time, good night.